And before we continue, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the lands on which we are settled upon. We're coming from many places today, and we wanted to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and traditional territories of Indigenous people who have been here since time immemorial, and to recognize that we must continue to build solidarity and kinship with them. I acknowledge that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Nanticoke Lenape Tribal Nation, Powhatan Lenape Nation, Ramapo Lenape Nation, Brotherton peoples, and intertribal folks have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways on what is now the state of New Jersey, which is where I reside. We invite you to join us in expressing our immense gratitude for the land we reside on and honoring Indigenous peoples for continuously living, working on, and caring for this land. Um, we we wanted to acknowledge that this country would not exist if not for the free and enslaved labor of Black people. So we honor the legacy of the African diaspora and Black life, joy, and knowledge. This land and labor acknowledgement is a reminder to reflect on the longstanding history that has brought us here to reside on this land, and to seek to understand our complicity and place within that history, as colonialism remains a current and ongoing process. After all, this land will forever, regardless of the United States law, be Indigenous land. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about our amazing guest speaker today, Mr. Maybee. He is Seneca and enrolled in Northern Arapaho and raised on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation of Indians in Western New York. He is an accomplished artist, public speaker, performer, and is currently the Assistant Director of Development at the Native American Rights Fund, or NARF. Mr. Maybee has a bachelor's degree in philosophy as well as a Juris Doctorate from the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law with an emphasis in federal Indian law. And to give you a little bit of context on the Native American Rights Funds, they are a 50-year-old legal nonprofit that provides high-level legal advocacy for Native individuals and communities throughout the U.S. They are legal experts and thought leaders in federal Indian law, and their casework and programming serve tribal communities in a variety of environmental, racial equity, and social justice areas. And simply put, their mission is to hold governments accountable through litigation, legal advocacy, and legal expertise. Prior to NARF, Mr. Nate Maybee was the chief operating officer and executive director of the 98-year-old Southwestern Association of Indian Arts, the nonprofit that produces the acclaimed Santa Fe Indian Market. Mr. Maybee's performing arts background has taken him across the world, including the world-renowned American Indian Dance Theater, as well as the Peter Buffet production Spirit the Seventh Fire. As an artist, his work can be found in private collections and museums across the country, including the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, the Autry Museum, the Hurd, and the Portland Art Museum. He has won numerous awards, including Best of Show at the prestigious Santa Fe Indian Market, the Cherokee Art Museum, and the Haudenosaunee art show. And yeah, so now I would like to pass it over to Mr. Maybee. Thank you so much. We're really excited to have you.
All right, thank you. Despite the little bit of difficulties, I've never come across that before. I appreciate the introduction. It's always a great opportunity to meet new friends and make new allies, and kind of find some commonalities that address some of the many challenges that we all face as citizens of this country, as people of color. And NARF has an interesting history. It's often on the backs of civil rights movements that Native American rights are often addressed. You guys got a pretty good background of kind of where I came from, and some of the other orgs that I was, had the pleasure of participating in the not so recent past. But I've been at NARF for about 4.5 years. I primarily handle all our foundation relationships. So I do a lot of grant writing and reporting. I have the luxury of getting to know a lot of our casework and programming, and I get to chat about it all the time. So I figured I'd probably start with kind of a brief history of NARF. I understand that you guys had a nice little primer discussion and conversation about things like tribal sovereignty and perhaps some of the contemporary challenges. And, I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some contemporary legal issues. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of the Indian wars are still happening. We're still fighting for our tribal sovereignty. We're still fighting for our rights. And we'll kind of discuss some of those concepts briefly. I wanted to ask, though, how much time would you like to leave for a little bit of Q&A at the end?
I would suggest like 15 to 30 minutes as possible, but like just as much as you can give.
Okay, so how much time does that give me now exactly?
I think that gives you about like an hour or less, like probably 50 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the Native American Rights Fund started about 53 years ago. The California Indian Legal Defense Fund was a program developed by the Ford Foundation, and they were a big sponsor of those initial efforts to provide legal advocacy for tribal nations. There's about 574 federally recognized tribes. We all have and participate in what's called a federal trust relationship with the United States. And it really is a long and complicated history of our relationship from the first contact, really, with Europeans who immigrated to this country and their contact with the tribes here. And we can talk a little bit about that because it really is a foundation for how we got to where we are today and kind of where we hope to go in the future. But some of the foundational concepts like treaty rights and tribal sovereignty, those are concepts that are probably appropriately addressed from the get-go so that you can be thinking about these things, because they really have shaped the way that we fight some of these fights and have fought some of these legal fights for the last 53 years and even longer than before NARF existed. So in the early days of NARF, the idea was to create a high-level legal advocacy practice group that could really help California tribes address some of their issues. There's, over 100 different tribes in California alone. A lot of, you've probably seen some rancherias and things if you've spent any time here, from Southern California through Central California, all the way up to Northern California. Like most tribes, they've had a long and complicated history with settlers and encroachment on their traditional homelands. And we got our start because we had hoped to address some of those needs. John Echo Hawk and some of the early attorneys came out of law school at a time when there weren't very many tribal attorneys to begin with. But there really is nobody better suited to understand the unique challenges of tribal nations than, community members who have grown up in those communities. And so he was approached, he accepted, but within the first year or two, they quickly realized a couple different things. One, legal needs for tribal nations spread and occur throughout the country. Many different tribes heard about this early form of the Native American Rights Fund and approached us and said, "Hey, can you help us as well?" And then we also quickly realized that due to the nature of that federal trust relationship, one particular case had the potential to impact every single tribe, regardless of region, regardless of location or tribal membership. When you look at Western law, you quickly realize that federal Indian law, the laws that pertain specifically to tribal nations, they will apply to all tribal nations, especially if it's a decision that comes from the United States Supreme Court. So we partnered with CU Boulder. Back then, they didn't have the digital information as accessible as it is now, and they needed a physical law library so that they could go and find case books and physically research relevant law as it pertained to their cases. And they relocated to right actually on Boulder campus, if you know CU Boulder at all. And there we've been for 50 years. We have since opened satellite offices in Alaska as well as DC. We are a nonpartisan organization. We've sued and litigated on behalf of tribal nations against clients on both sides of the aisle, because we recognize that you know, there's this implication that if we lose at the federal level, or if there are state courts that push casework up to the federal level, we have to succeed. We have to find success. And so because there's implications for all different types of law that fall under the umbrella of federal Indian law. I will say, you know, a lot of times people ask us, and this is something to kind of put in the back of your mind, well, what can I do? I don't come from these communities, you know, I don't really know anything about the state of Native nations in the country today. How can I help? What can I offer? And so the short answer, and we can kind of get into it as we get further along in this conversation, the short answer is just, you know, be an ally, educate yourself about the issues, do a little bit of research, and then see if there's some overlap with some of the concerns that you may have in your own life. A lot of times when we talk about like water law, for instance, it's not just our aquifers, waterways, and lakes that are often impacted. Its impacts are felt throughout the region. So when we talk about our sovereign rights and treaty rights as they pertain to protecting our water, we also realize that we're also fighting to protect all the cities and villages and little communities that lie outside the exterior boundaries of our reservations, but still use and enjoy and need to have their water protected. And so NARF really has 5 mission priorities that we regularly address, that guide the decisions on which cases that we undertake. And as we talk about each of these priorities briefly, you know, there might be something that you are interested in, that you may feel like being a little bit more educated on, and maybe even finding out how it might relate to you and the direction that you're going to take in your own life. And so that's one way that you guys can get involved. Others is educating your relatives and friends, and as you expand your professional networks, let them know, hey, these fights are ongoing and they're continuing. Some of our water law cases have gone on for 30, almost 40 years, as it just takes so much time and technical expertise to really flesh out what the implications are to some of these issues. And so this federal Indian law is really a term, and I'll refer to it quite a bit, but it can actually refer to a lot of different areas. When you talk about federal Indian law, the first thing to understand is that we are talking about the law as it pertains to federally recognized tribes. A lot of states have a lot of state recognized tribes or unrecognized tribes. When we say federal Indian law, it mainly pertains to those tribes who have been federally recognized by the government and which we have a formal relationship with. Not every tribe had treaties. That's one thing that a lot of people don't understand, is some had a unique relationship in that they agreed to certain things with the federal government in order to concede certain things, natural resources, land base, in exchange for other things like food and shelter and education, implementation, so that they could farm and become a little more sedentary than the nomadic hunters that they may have been. Others treated to end wars with the United States government. And when you look at the U.S. Constitution, it's important to remember that right at the very beginning, the language says the United States Constitution and treaties are the supreme law of the land. as such, we've had amendments, and it's changed here and there to expand its scope of protections. But treaty rights are one of the foundational aspects of federal Indian law that tribes have relied on. We conceded so many things. Much of the wealth of this country was built on the back and through the acquiring of not only natural resources, but land-based. We conceded much of that Aboriginal title in order to not have war, to make sure that our subsistence rights were respected. We could still hunt where we needed to. We could still fish where we needed to provide for our communities. And so when we fight for treaty rights, we really are trying to fight for a tribe's ability to simply live according to their traditions and customs. That's on its most basic level why we engage in the work that we do. So we assert, and we defend, and we protect treaty rights. We protect tribal sovereignty because we choose to engage in our cultural identity in a way that is meaningful to us, that recognizes perhaps our spiritual place in the universe, the ways that we were given. We, like most cultures, believe that they were given to us by Creator or God. We call him man above in my culture. So it's incredibly important, in order to preserve that cultural identity and to have that cultural identity remain intact, that our forms of government are recognized, that they can still be comprised and assert authority and sovereignty over their membership, so they can enjoy the benefits of whatever their community and tribal identity is. And one thing that's important to recognize is that cultural identity is extremely diverse in Indian country. The media and movies and Hollywood and television and oftentimes they provide a small snapshot of one particular culture, maybe even a snapshot of a particular culture that 5 or 6 different tribes might enjoy because of their location geographically and the circumstances that made them a buffalo hunting culture or a horse culture or a Pacific Northwest fishing culture, whatever it was. What is more important is that regionally, environments are different and cultures are very, very different. Each tribe has their own ceremonies, their own languages. There are regional kind of family subgroups and language groups that might have similar things, but for the most part, each tribe is very, very unique. Each tribe chooses to often engage in a political process that is very different than the next tribe. The U.S. Constitution, tribes weren't considered U.S. citizens until 1924, I think. So it was relatively new for tribes to really consider themselves citizens of both countries and engage in the political process for both U.S. citizenship and tribal citizenship. Many tribes today, the tribal members will say, I'm Arapaho first, or I'm Seneca first, or I'm whatever tribe they are, because their people and their descendants have been the people much longer than this country has even existed. But we do enjoy the benefits of dual citizenship, and we act accordingly. So that foundation of preservation of tribal cultural identity comes from protecting our tribal sovereignty through treaty right. There are often complicated issues that arise as tribes and the U.S. government has had to decide who is a tribal member, who is identified as this federally recognized tribal member. For example, there's a new movie coming out later on this fall by director Scorsese, Killers of the Flower Moon. It's based on a book about some murders that occurred and some pretty horrendous circumstances that occurred on the Osage Nation in their territory. Long story short, prior to these events, as reservation boundaries were determined, sometimes they were expanded, more often they were just simply diminished. They didn't realize what the value was because there was inherent natural resources underground. And this included oil, a lot of oil fields and deposits in Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, and in what land base the Osage Nation currently occupies. When the treaties were enacted and accepted, oftentimes it was in areas that had very little natural resources. They were terrible areas for farming. There was no trees for wood harvesting. They were too arid, they were too wet, or they were too sparsely populated with wild game. But there were monkey wrenches that were thrown in as things like gold or natural gas or oil were found on those reservations. At some points in time, some of the policies changed. And as tribes benefited from these newly discovered resources, as you can imagine, there was a lot of efforts to separate those tribes from those resources. And so when I say, that the wealth of this nation was built on the back of tribal nations, and I'll kind of talk about that in a second, it was no joke. Even just the ability to gain 5 or 10 acres as an individual tribal member was taken advantage of. Sometimes they knew there was water. And so people who had lived within communities but weren't descendants of those tribal nations would claim membership. They would bribe and pay to include their membership, their new identity on census rolls, thus making them eligible for land grants, for acreage, and then everything else that came from that possession, from that fee ownership. But to go back to circle around to the Killers of the Flower Moon, after oil was found on Osage Nation territory, there was a concerted effort by individuals and families to marry tribal members in an effort to gain co-ownership, and then they would murder their spouses in order to gain full membership of those titles and ownership. And as those things started to occur over the span of 10, 12 years, finally a fledgling FBI came in and investigated. They knew who had committed some of these atrocities, certain families in particular, as outlined in the movie, but there was still no real meaningful prosecution of these individuals, let alone a reversion of some of that title back into the appropriate Osage Nation's hands. So, why do we talk about these things? There's a subset of this political dialogue that says, well, all that stuff happened in the past. It shouldn't be impacting the future. Why should we even bother studying these things? And we study them so we don't commit them again, so that we have a historical foundation to understand some of this generational poverty and trauma that has occurred, in the hopes that maybe we can remedy it. Simply ignoring something doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and more importantly, that we, as mutual community members in this larger nation of humanity, can't recognize those ills and work together to figure out how to remedy it. Sometimes it does mean things like land back. Sometimes it means like honor your treaty. But again, that history is pretty complicated, probably a little too complicated to really dive into in the hour and a half that we have together. But I would say go to our website and do a little bit of research. The umbrella, and this might be an appropriate time to talk about different types of work that we engage in the hopes that perhaps there's something that might interest you, something that might affect you and your communities. You know, as I mentioned, tribal rights, tribal sovereignty, and treaty rights is an area of law that we hit pretty hard. Sometimes those treaty rights are as simple as subsistence hunting and fishing, a guaranteed ability to simply engage in things on some of those Pacific waterways and up in Alaska, to not only live, but to help provide for their families. And so we protect those rights. Much of where I live in Wyoming, we've got a pretty good sized reservation. We share it with the Eastern Band of Shoshones. It's about 2.2 million acres. There's large waterways, big lake, there's man-made lake, and there's a lot of mountains, as well as herds, large herds of elk and white-tailed deer and mule deer, tons and tons of antelope. But many of the tribal members engage in subsistence hunting to simply provide meat for their families. There is a poverty level on many reservations that is still per capita a little under the U.S. average. There's lower income equality, there's lower food sovereignty for them. And so to engage in subsistence hunting, as they have for generations, is an important part of some of the things that we do. And some of the early cases, like US v. Washington, that was a case where the tribe knew that they had treaty rights, but the state was saying, no, you're within the exterior boundaries of the state of Washington. You have to obey the fish and game laws like everybody else. There was no recognition by the state of Washington that federal tribes within the state of Washington were separate sovereign, like their own little states. And so the U.S. intervened. We intervened on behalf of some plaintiffs. And at the end of the day, the Supreme Court recognized, yes, they have rights guaranteed under this treaty, and we need to allow them to exercise those rights. It was a huge victory for a tribe that couldn't have ever afforded the legal representation necessary, but thankfully, due to our organization, we were able to represent them regardless of cost, regardless of the duration of the litigation, and we still engage in those practices today. Much of our budget is organized by philanthropy, and through philanthropy. We have a lot of individual donors who donate $5, $10, $100, $1,000. We are a 501c3. We do have a large number of foundations who support our work and recognize that we are fighting not just for our rights, but we're protecting waterways for our allies and for the communities that surround us as well. And so they support some of our work. Sometimes that fight is a very unique angle. When we were fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline up in South Dakota, it was a losing case for most of the communities that lay under the proposed pathway, because the states could decide, the representatives could vote, the governor could, with a stroke of a pen, allow permits and things to happen. And the only way to really combat that was to vote their elected officials out of office, and it wouldn't have happened. But they didn't count on the assertion of our treaty rights, which guarantee that the U.S. will protect the health and welfare of our tribal citizens, and that includes the waterways. And so with those unique circumstances of using our treaty rights to assert our right to have clean water and not jeopardize it, we were able to win some significant victories against some of these pipelines. We also gained a lot of allies in the process. Some of these ranchers and people who had land eminent domain through the state were grateful that we were able to take on some of these huge industries with huge deep pockets and find a way to achieve some common goals. So treaty rights are often incredibly important to some of this work. But as I mentioned before, not every tribe has treaty rights. They don't have the ability to assert their subsistence hunting rights. So to kind of take a step back, though, in talking about treaty rights, there's a series of Supreme Court decisions called the Marshall Trilogy. And in that trilogy, the Supreme Court really had to define what the relationship was like. It's where we first heard terms like the guardian trust relationship between tribes and the U.S. government. There was a very paternalistic approach towards that relationship. The Department of the Interior created a subset called the Bureau of Indian Affairs that was meant to oversee the administration of some of these things that were guaranteed under our treaty rights: education and boarding schools, farming, and treaty implementations that were supposed to be given to tribes. And many tribes still recognize their part in those treaty relationships and negotiations. There's, I believe, a tribe, might be the Passamaquoddies in Maine. They still deliver 2 deer to the state steps of the state house in honor of the treaty that they entered into with the state. The Seneca Nation, we still receive X amount of yards of fabric. It's like a type of muslin that the U.S. guaranteed to us in the state of New York in exchange for some treaties. Now, have they totally ignored other aspects of the treaties? Absolutely. So, the fact that they're still giving us this trade cloth, we call it treaty cloth, it's an interesting thing that a lot of people don't understand. But I think people like the symbolism, and they appreciate at least that recognition of some aspects of our treaty right. So going back to U.S. v. Washington, that was a major landmark state, or state Supreme Court, state case that had gone to the Supreme Court that recognized the part that treaties play in this relationship. From the Marshall Trilogy, however, things like the forced Cherokee Trail of Tears and removals happened. There was a similar Navajo Nation forced removal. Many tribes were displaced during those very difficult times from the late 1700s all the way through, into the early 20th century, the early 1900s. But despite all of that, tribes continue to maintain their cultures, their identities, despite some very restrictive religious freedom infringements. We couldn't practice our ceremonies. Many of those things went underground until later on in the mid-1900s. Tribes just struggled to survive and fought to retain their language and their cultural identity. But amidst all of that, there was assimilative policies that actively sought to diminish tribal membership through blood quantum, through diluting blood quantum and intermarriage. Others, it was more insidious, where they wanted to simply absorb tribal nations into the communities around them. They created policies that were maybe well-intentioned. They wanted to give job training to tribal members. So they created job centers and promised them work in some of the big city centers: Minneapolis, Chicago, New York, LA, and entire hundreds and thousands of natives left with the promise of work, only to find that they were often stranded at bus stops and to fend for themselves. Luckily, tribal members who were in those cities, they know how to take care of each other, as they had taken care of each other in their communities back home. And even today, it's estimated that probably 55% of federally recognized tribal members live in urban centers throughout the nation. They're not even on tribal homeland. And I'm one of them. I left when I turned 18 to go to college across the country. And I return home as much as possible, but I've never set up permanent residence since then. I maintain my participation in our tribal ceremonies and intertribal social gatherings and things, but I've made my life in an urban center in the Denver area in the hopes that the things and skills and experiences I have had throughout the years will allow me to be a more effective advocate for some of the issues that face our tribal people on reservation as well as off reservation. So these assimilative policies eventually yielded and were recognized as harmful to our cultural identity. And like I said, NARF even got its start on the heels of the original civil rights movements in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. We had our own movements happening. The American Indian movement were just people who fought for tribal rights. They didn't want to be singled out and brutalized by a militarized police force. They didn't want to be subjected to the blatant racism that occurred on, in border towns that lined the boundaries of the reservation. And so they fought. They took over things like Alcatraz. They occupied Alcatraz. They occupied BIA buildings, recognizing that the BIA was really another tool of assimilation in a lot of ways, and often did more harm than good in protecting tribal rights. They occupied locations like Wounded Knee, one of the sites of the most horrific massacres that has occurred on U.S. soil. They wanted to raise awareness. They wanted to fight. And so on the heels of these movements is where NARF found its origin stories, and we've engaged in this work. Another area that we spend quite a considerable time on is our social justice, which kind of parlays with our racial equity work, especially in the voting rights realm. As I mentioned before, we've only been U.S. citizens for about 100 years, and it's even taken longer for real meaningful active participation in the political voting process. And I was one of them. When I was a young man, there was conversations. Well, we are our own people. We have our own government. Why even bother participating in elections at a local or state or federal level? Your vote won't matter. And I was deceived. I didn't realize that there's political power, even for individuals, in the simple act of voting and engaging in the political process of voting for someone who represents your values. And it doesn't matter, what value system you adhere to, what you believe will be the moral pathway through this life and this political life that you will lead as citizens of this country or wherever you're from. But what is important is that you exercise that individual sovereignty, that you vote according to your conscience, that you participate in the process, and then accept the process, regardless of what happens, and see if there are some areas where we can come together and find some mutually agreeable areas. I don't think this country has ever agreed, and with the accessibility of nation states, what we can do, however, is critically think about the process and about the role that we play in that process. So NARF engaged in a series of research expeditions because we wanted to understand why tribal members weren't engaging in the census process, which has voting rights implications, let alone participating in state and local and federal elections. Because per capita, we had abysmally small, and in many areas we still do, we had abysmally small participation numbers. But again, it was because we were deceived. There's this narrative that, somehow by participating in the process, we're participating in a colonized process. But that's just simply not true, because whether we like it or not, we are dual citizens, and our representatives have a direct impact on things that we do every day, the amount of taxes that we pay, where that tax money goes, what our infrastructure looks like, and how the representatives choose to improve or maintain or neglect that infrastructure. Education curriculum, the separation of church and state, all those things come about by the people that we are supposed to say, hey, you represent us at this whatever level, go and vote accordingly, or else we're going to vote you out and put somebody in who does represent the majority. And so we started to recognize that census participation was low because tribal people were averse to having people know anything about them. We had seen the ill effects of registration and making the governments aware that this is my family, this is the size of my family, this is where we live. And it was a complicated thing. But that census participation is what determines the districting maps for our chosen representative. And there are very real efforts and gerrymandering efforts, if you've ever heard that word, that take those census results and they say, okay, you know, we've got a certain number of people that live in region A, and they all tend to vote Republican. So when they elect representatives, is that Republican reflective of the number of people that live there? Well, if it's 90% Republican, then yes. But what happens if 90% of the people are Democrats in that region, but they get divided into region B and C and D, where there's now just enough Republican representation to be elected, despite a Democratic majority in some areas. And when you have the system of government that we have, a direct democratic representative government, it's absolutely critical that the people who are elected to those positions represent and reflect the ideals and values of the people that live within those districts. So gerrymandering is a very real thing that we take on quite a bit. We started to wonder why, people weren't voting. And we started to realize that in some areas, especially in rural areas, your nearest polling place might be 60 miles away. The worst we ever saw was 99 miles away or 110 miles away or something like that, one way. So when you were talking about just simply voting, you were talking about a 3 to 4 hour round trip. And how do you go vote if you don't even have a car? What if you don't have a job to put gas in your car? And it made it impossible for people to participate. And especially now, when you see elections being decided by 500 votes or 1,000 votes or 2,000 votes, and the tribal community within that voting district is 5,000 people strong, oh, you bet you don't want them to participate if you want a certain, outcome. They will have a direct impact, and we've seen that in certain areas like Arizona, a classically red state that has turned a different color because of tribal participation. There's several 100,000 tribal members in the state of Arizona. Many are Democratic, others are Republican, and when they all vote, boy, that impact sure is felt. And so as we identified some of these issues, other issues for state legislation that requires a physical address on your official recognized identification. And that seems fair, right? Well, on some of these rural reservations, there's only a postal bank at a building down in the city, in the cultural community center. There is no physical addresses as outlined by the United States Postal Service. And so they wouldn't be able to vote since their IDs don't have a physical address on them. So we file litigation to change that, say, hey, this violates the Voting Rights Act. You need to give them all the due process necessary under these federal election laws that allow them to participate as citizens of the United States. We've taken on a lot of gerrymandering and redistricting things in the last couple of years because of the recent census efforts. We do very boots on the ground type work, like getting new polling places that are within the communities that they serve. We solicit, we realized a lot of the election materials in the last were only written in English. Well, English is not the first language in some of those Inupiq and Yupik communities. So we, under Section 203, we've sought to assist and enforce translation services into their native languages so that they can participate and understand who they're voting for and where they stand on some of these issues. We've changed voter ID law requirements. We've hit the polling place stuff. We produce a lot of materials. We actually spearhead what's called the Native American Voting Rights Coalition, which is a coalition and network of attorneys, academics, voting rights experts, voting rights organizations, consultants, who all are in the business of making sure that everybody has a fair part in this political process, in this election process. We bring litigation when necessary. We provide support for the advocates in those regions that need assistance or need consultants or need people who can analyze the districting maps and then testify accordingly. All these things swirl around in an effort to just simply protect your ability to vote. Some of the, one of the campaigns in South Dakota, we filed on behalf of a tribal member who is a highly decorated war veteran from Vietnam. And he returns home, and if anybody had the right to vote, it's the person who is literally sacrificed and bled, that we all get to enjoy the freedoms that this company or this country allows. But he couldn't vote because of some of these restrictive voting laws. It made no sense. So we stepped in and we fought, and we were able to reverse some of those things. Because of this political conversation that's happening now and has gotten to be very divisive and challenging, that work is even more critical. It's probably about a third of our casework right now. It's pretty exciting because we feel like tribes are stepping up and saying, hey, we want real representation, and we're starting to see it. We've got representatives and congressmen and women in the House and in the Senate. We have cabinet positions that are filled with tribal members. Just yesterday, on Sunday, I sat on a voting rights panel with Congresswoman Sharice David from Kansas, and she never intended to go to the halls of Congress to represent her district. But she recognized that the longtime congressperson who had been in that position just was not representing the people. And they hadn't had a woman represent that district in decades. So she stood up and said, hey, I'm going to run because somebody needs to change this paradigm. And here we are. She's going into her second, I believe her third term. And she's doing some great work. Most importantly for us, though, is despite the fact that the majority of her district is non-Indian, she came from a tribal background where she recognizes that, hey, federal Indian law has a place, and I can help in some small way to alleviate some of these challenges that many tribal nations face. So it's wonderful to have an advocate who actually understands and can act accordingly to address these things in the House of Representatives. Let's see. So I don't want to belabor voting rights too much. We actually have a lot of different portals that you can kind of zoom off in as you get into some of these areas. But we provide a lot of resource materials. We spend a lot of time developing materials that tribal leaders and councils can pass out to their community members and just simply help them understand why it's important to vote, what they can do, why it's different, why one individual act of individual sovereignty has the potential to impact so many things that directly impact our lives. So just kind of as a challenge, I really applaud your group coming together and having these oftentimes difficult conversations. it's eye-opening to realize that our world is much, much bigger than, what we're going to wear and where we're going to work that day, or how much school we're going to participate in. That there are all these other things that just come with the freedoms that we enjoy. And so, my challenges to you is to engage in a critical thought process that allows you to, to hear both sides, assess it for yourself, and then act accordingly. And if that means joining some of NARF works in some way, then definitely perfect. Thank you. Then great. And as we get closer to the Q&A section of this presentation, just keep in mind that there is no bad question. This really is a safe place that you can ask whatever question is on your mind, no matter how inconsequential or how controversial. I promise you, I've probably heard a similar question a few times in my life, and I will lay it out as best as I can. And if I can't, then hopefully I can point you in the direction of somebody who can. But as I mentioned early in the presentation, a lot of what we do has implications for all of us, especially people of color. Many of our challenges are challenges that many of our communities have faced. Interestingly, the Asian and Pacific Islander community, a particularly strong foundation that supports voting rights for them, supports voting rights for us, because they see the impact, even though we're not a demographic that they would typically support. So moving kind of beyond voting rights, there's some other key issues that are important to understand. Things that might have popped up in the national discourse regarding Indian law. One is the recent Brackeen decision. The Indian Child Welfare Act was an act of legislation passed 30 plus years ago to protect Native children. On its face, people had long recognized that per capita tribal children were being removed from tribal homes and communities at a rate far greater than non-Indian. Part of it was because they felt like tribal youth had no place being in some of these communities. They needed to be removed for their good, to educate them. There's literally a quote that says, "Kill the Indian, save the man." But what that does is it removes and strips their cultural identity completely. Many of these children leave their communities and have no sense of self or how to use their culture to address the many challenges of this life. And it leads to things like higher incidences of homelessness and poverty and addiction. And so when this act was created and passed, it was recognized as kind of as it's been in practice over the years, it's been recognized as one of the gold standards for child welfare, not just Indian child welfare, but child welfare in general. It creates a placement preference for Native youth that says, okay, if the child has to be removed from their home in the best interest of the child, we'll try and place them with an immediate tribal family member, aunts, uncles, grandparents, brother, sister. If that's not possible, then they'll be placed with at least a community member, somebody from the same tribe. If that's not possible, then at least they'll be placed with a tribal member from a different tribe, somebody that understands what this cultural identity is and hopefully has the resources necessary to assist them as they go through these real and so NARF coordinated the amicus brief for over 500 of the 574 recognized tribes that stepped in and said, hey, this is incredibly important to our children, to our cultural identity. You cannot overturn this case. And it really was a dispute about a placement preference for a child, and tribal child, and a well-intentioned foster placement. Case has held that this is the gold standard. This is what works the best. This has the best impact for long term on these children. This is a congressional act, but they actually finally found a very conservative district court judge in Texas, where they were able to find the right claimants and Indian child and challenge this state law this federal law that has been applauded by not just tribal members and nations, but non-Indian adoption agencies, foster placement agencies, state agencies as well. Our amicus was signed on to by almost 30 different state attorney generals, and then dozens and dozens of foster and adoptive organizations, agencies, individual experts, people who recognize how successful this one act of bipartisan legislation has been. But again, it was a well-funded institute that took on this case and said, hey, this is not about the children. This is a violation of equal protection and due process. It is a race-based piece of legislation, and it should be overturned. But who was funding it were some very, very deep oil and extractive industries, monies that fueled into that flowed into this organization that funded this funded this litigation, because they recognized if you found that this relationship between the U.S. and tribes was race-based rather than political, as it has been defined for several hundred years, then this would dismantle many, many aspects of federal Indian law, this umbrella of law that pertains to tribes in the U.S. And that's dismantled all that land, those natural resources. They can fall into private hands, and now they're accessible to almost anyone, especially corporations, if there's no recognized tribal governments, if there's no sovereignty, and so on and so forth. So luckily it was upheld. They did punt kind of the equal protection argument, so we may actually see that again. But as the Supreme Court mentioned, that political relationship between tribes in the U.S. has been ongoing. It's been well defined throughout the years, and no Supreme Court has found it to be invalid. So it was a big victory for us, but we don't expect the challenge to disappear completely. There are always jurisdictional issues when it comes to criminal and civil law as it pertains to things that occur on reservations. Much of our litigation between the U.S. or states happens in federal court because of the nature of jurisdiction and standing in Western law. Some of those criminal jurisdiction issues come up, like in the McGirt decision, where Justice Gorsuch said, hey, look, we made some very real and sober promises to tribes through the form of our treaty agreements and things like that. It's about time that we live up to those things. We can't just ignore some of these agreements and these treaties. They should be able to depend on the promises made, as we have enjoyed the benefits of those promises. And so that was a big victory. It was eventually walked back a little bit in the Castro Huerta decision a couple years later. But some of our programs, like the Tribal Supreme Court Project, we recognize that if we lose one case, it's detrimental to all tribes, whether they were parties to that case or not, because of how Indian law is defined. And so the Tribal Supreme Court Project, we look at state cases or federal cases that have the potential to impact tribes and tribal sovereignty, and we provide assistance if necessary. We will help them with their research. We'll provide advocates or experts. We strategize. We'll even have practice moot court sessions so they can put forth the most strong and effective legal argument when they do get to the Supreme Court. We help them with resources if necessary. You know, NARF has the luxury of being able to represent tribes regardless of whether the tribe can pay for that legal advocacy or how long that legal advocacy takes. And again, that's thankfully due to a lot of philanthropy. 90% of our, 85% of our budget comes from people who just want to see tribal nations succeed and be protected. And so we're super grateful for that. Trying to think of, there's just so many things. I'm trying to think of anything that might be of real importance to talk about right now, but definitely, you know, hopefully your organizers can provide my contact information. If something pops up and it's keeping you up at night, just shoot me an email. Hopefully I can respond in a timely way and address some of those questions. Because as you dive into this world of federal Indian law, you'll see that it really is huge and immense, but the implications are really for all of us. So I do want to leave, you know, a good 15 minutes or so we can have some Q&A. If the organizers have something that they'd like me to briefly talk about, please, let's keep diving right in.
Yeah, thank you so much for talking to us and providing us with such a comprehensive overview. I know I learned so much, and I know I will be taking away so much in my own advocacy. So it's truly an honor to have you with us. So I know I have tons of questions and so much I want to discuss with you, but I just want to open it up for everyone else. Like if you could unmute yourself or like put your questions in the chat, that would be great. So yeah, this would be the time.
As people are kind of formulating some questions, I'll briefly mention that I was in Santa Fe, New Mexico this last weekend. There's a large event called Santa Fe Indian Market. It's a juried fine art fair with about 1,000 artists from across the country and Canada, where you can go and see art forms from many different levels. Tuck that away somewhere in the back of your mind, because it really is a must-see event. There's dance performances and bands. There's haute couture fashion, contemporary fashion events, as well as traditional clothing events. There's film festivals, a lot of panel discussions, as well as a lot of peripheral openings at many of the art and museum galleries in town. Santa Fe actually has the third largest fine art economy behind New York and LA. And much of that is Western and more importantly, Native American fine art. So I think there's 400 art galleries within a 5-mile radius of the downtown Plaza area. But this particular event is put on by a Native American organization called the Southwestern Association for Indian Arts. And it really is just a phenomenal snapshot and experience if you'd like to see Native American culture up close and at its finest. So put that on your calendar. It's always like the third week of August, but it's a great time. It's incredible to see.
Yeah, thank
How are we
you.
doing?
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, we actually got one question, which was sort of talking about the recent horrific fires in Maui. And we were wondering, like, this person asked that like there was a lawsuit in 2020 where Maui basically filed a lawsuit against big oil. And they were wondering whether a NARF has been part of this lawsuit and like whether it's going to be involved in any sort of litigation against like colonial like settlers or colonial like organizations.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually a fairly complex one as well. One of our board members is Hawaiian. Our board members are comprised of professionals and accomplished folks, leaders from across the country and regions. including Hawaii, because we recognize that Indigenous Hawaiian rights are sort of related to some of our federally recognized rights, but they are very still different, unfortunately. Because of the nature of the way that Hawaii was colonized, they weren't taken into a federal trust relationship like tribal nations were. And so while we do support the things that they are doing, and we actually have an active member on the board who keeps us apprised, much of our support for them, because of the way our policies are set up, we have to be approached by federally recognized tribes to engage in litigation on their behalf. And because they're not a federally recognized group quite yet, it's been difficult to figure out how to assist them. So we do strategize, we provide advice, but we can't represent Native Hawaiians in the traditional sense like we do represent tribal nations. But we routinely engage with them on some of these issues, and we definitely support them. We were having some conversations just this last week about how we can best support them in their efforts to protect their land and their ownership, help them rebuild their lives, and so we're trying to figure all that out in the midst of some pretty devastating circumstances.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. We actually had another question about federal recognition. So
Okay.
as you mentioned before, that like many indigenous communities don't have treaties or are not federally recognized. So what are like the benefits and the disadvantages of being federally recognized, and how do people go about the process of getting federal recognition?
Okay, so federal recognition started, as you might suspect, it was anybody that had dealings with the United States, and as it's defined now, the United States wants to see that there's been some form of government, traditional leadership throughout the centuries. It's easy when you have a treaty, because then oh, hey, the U.S. recognized this group of people as a sovereign, as a group that they could treat with. But for others, it just was a way to provide services. If they didn't have a formal treaty, but maybe they had a loose agreement that this territory over here would be theirs, they'd be able to hunt there. The government would provide things for them. Maybe it was the establishment of a reservation, then they were recognized. But there is literally a list in the Code of Federal Regulations and in other places that outlines who these 574 federally recognized tribes are. As time has gone, everything, and it makes zero sense, but it has literally happened. NARF has represented a few of these tribes. The process now is pretty convoluted. They need a lot of history and documented history of that tribe in that area, that tribe and their relationship with even prior to statehood for some places. They just need to see proof and evidence that that tribe has lived there and that they were there prior to the U.S. And it comes in often interesting ways: religious records, baptismal records, census rolls, things like that. But as part of that process, they just want to ensure that they are who they say they are, that they have blood and genealogical descendancy to the peoples that were there traditionally, and then they eventually get approved and are recognized. Sometimes it can be an act of Congress. A recent federally recognized tribe was voted on. They presented their evidence to the House and the Senate, and they were voted on and approved. But it is not easy. Sometimes that process takes decades. Some tribes are actively working on it now, so I suspect we'll see hopefully that number grow a little bit, but it can be an uphill battle for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just had a question before I asked it. I just wanted to say thank you. And I know that you educated me a lot on voter suppression, and especially in relationship with native voter dilution, which I feel like is less talked about. And I've tried to stay like up to date with the Burkine v. Holland case, but I know that you taught me so much, and you provided like a unique and invaluable legal lens, especially as you worked on the front line. So thank you so much for that. And in terms of my question, I was wondering, how does NARF like balance fighting for all Indigenous people's rights, since they are a political category, while being conscious of the specific demands and needs of particular communities?
It's a good question. Obviously our mission mandates that we primarily represent tribal nations and their rights. And unfortunately, sometimes there are real pressing issues that we just can't engage in because we don't have a tribe that engages us. We have to be hired by a tribe to represent them in that Western legal scenario. And if we don't get a tribe to do so, then maybe we seek to assist in other ways. Maybe we'll even with amicus briefs, we have to have somebody approach us. So sadly, there are a lot of issues that we wish we could be a part of, but we can't officially take a stance on just because we haven't been engaged by a tribe. But we do recognize again that a lot of our allies come from other BIPOC communities. And so we participate in other ways. Sometimes it's just simply having and adding a voice to some of those conversations and narratives. Many of us sit on a variety of different boards that serve other communities of color. So we can lend some of our expertise and some of our voice to those. Other times, as individual NARF staff and attorneys, hopefully that answers your question a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We also have another question about NARF's litigation process and how that works.
NARF's what process?
Litigation process, like when a community reaches out to you.
Yeah, sure. So we actually have a request for assistance process. People fill out a form online, or they can submit it to us, where they just simply describe their problem. They have a chance to give us the background. We do have capacity issues because we're not as big as we need to be. So unfortunately, we can't represent every request that comes our way. So we have to select the cases and litigation work that is the most impactful to all tribes, not perhaps just one community. That request for assistance goes before a formal litigation management committee that evaluates it. Sometimes they have to do a little bit deeper dive in terms of the research and where that case is legally, if it's, because sometimes it's a little ways into the process. We have to see if we can even intervene on behalf of them in some instances. There are so many little nuances to the practice of Western law that, geez, a lot of things have to kind of swirl together just to make litigation happen. But we do our best, and while we can't get to every case, boy, it does mean that the ones that we are able to take on, it's incredibly important. So after that is assessed, and if we decide that we're going to take the case, then a few attorneys get assigned to it, and the work starts. A lot of research, a lot of assessment, making sure that our claims and filings are timely and efficient, as well as on point for whatever we're trying to achieve. And then it just goes through the process. You file your claim, they respond, they decide if this is something that can be mutually agreed upon in terms of a remedy or to the problem. If not, then it gets assigned to trial, and you just start putting together your casework for the trial. But then it goes from there, and sometimes it gets appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. Sometimes it doesn't. Yeah, but that's essentially the process in a nutshell.
Thank you. And then I had one last question. I know we're hitting time, but you mentioned the DAPL movement. And I remember that like the Keystone XL pipeline, which is another oil pipeline, President Biden ended up revoking the permit around like July 2021. So I was wondering if that has sort of some consequences in terms of like the Dakota Access Pipeline. Like, do you think that sort of creates a precedent for like the government support, like having less support for these extractive oil companies, or like, is there any way this pushes us towards some sort of like victory or not really?
Ooh, so the dynamics of energy independence and production for the U.S. That's a pretty complicated question. But yes, every case that we're involved in usually implicates protection of tribal communities. So the same issues that applied at DAPL and the Dakota Access Pipeline were the same ones that we were taking on for Keystone XL. We actually represented the tribe on the Keystone XL fight. And depending on the policies of the administration, some will push it forward because they believe that somehow that'll increase our energy independence from foreign sources. But that's not what the Keystone XL was. The Keystone XL was literally oil flowing from the tar sands of Canada through the United States to the Gulf of Mexico for export. There was really only a few shareholders and interests that were going to benefit from that pipeline. There weren't a lot of jobs that were going to be created after the pipeline had been built. But despite the wealth that would have flowed into this small group of people's pockets, it was all the communities that lay along the pipeline that bore the risk. It's no secret that pipelines burst and spill routinely. And so it really was this coalition of people that came forward and said, heck no, this is not going to help us with our energy independence. Why would we do this and endanger our communities to make a few people wealthy? It just made zero sense. And luckily, the Biden administration recognized that and was able to nip it in the bud. But that's not to say that it won't reappear, because it very well could. But I'm very pleased to say that, communities and nations are taking a hard look at the climate change issue and acting accordingly. I think green energy and green energy policies and projects need to be the focus and direction, and with of the near future. Hopefully, we'll start to see the benefits of that before we mess things up too much, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I know we reached time. And thank you for graciously offering your contact information just in case anyone needs.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
yeah. And we also want to put the donation link for NARF just in case if anyone wants to support in the future, as well as sort of amplify the fact that like a lot of locals in Maui need our help. So if you could provide some kind of mutual aid there, that would also be great. In addition to that, I know many of the sort of like events that you mentioned in your talk, whether that was like Wounded Knee or Alcatraz or like the Trail of Tears, was something that we went over in our overview yesterday. So like if you want more information, I can send you that information. But yeah, thank you so much for talking to us. It was really a pleasure having you and an honor. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you guys again for your interest and in some of these contemporary issues. It's we're all about creating allies and educating each other. So thank you.
Thank you. If you ever need the help, our help, or the help of our organizers, we're more than willing to do our part or support.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Take care, everyone.